All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to AI Governance Essentials. I am Mike Yang, the Senior Director of Artificial Intelligence Advisory Services at Husch, and just want to welcome all of you to what I hope will be an interesting hour-long conversation around AI governance and going through the essentials of AI governance, or at least some of the things that I think you need to know. Just a bit about me. My role at Husch is focused on helping organizations in all stages of their AI journeys. Before joining Husch, I spent 11 years on the digital media legal team at Adobe, where, among other things, I provided legal support for Adobe's AI-enabled products and services, and the governance efforts that went along with that work. So I'll try to draw from my experiences, but also try to provide you all with some timely and, again, hopefully interesting information around AI governance. Before we jump in, just want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the top of your audience console today, there are a few applications for your use. So you can press those buttons if you need to. And if you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the question box. I don't anticipate we're going to have enough time to get to those questions live, but please enter them, and we will be monitoring that chat, particularly if you have technical issues. But we also will be answering those questions via email to follow up this presentation. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder, so please take a look at that. And auto-generated captions are available for today's program, so you can turn those on by clicking the CC button on the bottom right corner of the media player box. For those of you who are legal professionals in the room, the program has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, you can report your hours by clicking on the continuing education sign-in link at the top of your screen, and a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be mailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. And you will see some interactive questions throughout the presentation to ensure that you are staying engaged. We are required to do that. Don't worry, they're easy questions. Towards the end of the program, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are relevant and hopefully interesting to you. This is the fourth in our series of webinars. We have a number more planned, so we appreciate all of you attending, and we hope to continue to push out this programming in a way that is helpful to you. So I think that's it for our housekeeping items. Let's get started. I just did the welcome, so I'll skip that slide. Here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about AI governance at a really high level, touching on some of the risks, some of the rules that apply, some of the controls that you can put in place. I'm going to focus the bulk of my time talking about ISO 42001, but not just digging into that, the ISO standard. I'm going to give you an overview of it, but I'm really going to use that as a guide for talking about AI governance. You'll see what I mean in a few minutes, but I think that'll be helpful and useful to you, whether or not you are planning to comply with or certify to the ISO standard. And then I'm gonna, assuming, and hopefully we have enough time, to just touch on the AI action plan, because it is fairly timely, it is fairly recent, and I think for those of you here who are in the US, which I think should be most, if not all of you, to give you some timely information about where the US is heading with responsible AI adoption and how that fits with obligations around AI governance. Okay, so first, a couple of definitions, and you can see here that I say governance is the operating system for trustworthy, effective AI. I think that's true. I think it's actually a little more than that, and what it really is how an organization identifies, builds, and checks on their responsible use of AI to make sure that it's useful, safe, compliant, aligned with business objectives. There are other benefits around building out governance, which I'll touch on, but I think this is a good, succinct, and easy way to look at it. And why do you need it? Well, as a business, helps you build trust, both with your internal stakeholders as well as your customers and users. It enables you to do compliance, and it actually helps deliver value in a number of ways. Efficiency is one of them, but you can, I think, chart the value to a number of practical benefits that governance will give you. So Here are some building blocks, and I've tried to boil a lot of this down into hopefully easy to understand pieces, and which are going to build on one another as we go through this presentation. So let's just start with defining a few of the building blocks I think are important to keep an eye on. First one is clear roles and rules. So who is doing what, I think, is the best way to look at it. Who's approving the AI, who owns the risk, who has the obligation to take action, and who and what is allowed, or who is allowed to do what, I guess is a way to look at that last piece there. So I think that's really important, because you don't want to run into an issue and then have to decide who's responsible for it, who needs to take action, who owns that issue. Hopefully that is all well defined up front. The lifecycle controls, I think, are mostly relevant to developers, not as much users. But if you're developing AI, to make sure that you have the appropriate checkpoints in place throughout your design, your testing, your launch, and monitoring process. So the full development lifecycle. Data discipline is very important. And I think data discipline comes into play not only for developers, but also for users or anybody who is improving upon AI technology. For example, you're fine-tuning a model with your own data. So understanding the data provenance, making sure that you are addressing or taking into account the privacy issues. To the extent there is licensed content in your data set, making sure that you are understanding where you stand with licensing. And then data retention, very important too, not only for the data sets generally, but of course, from a privacy perspective, and we'll touch on that a little more later. Doing risk and impact reviews, always very important to understand the risks and then the corresponding mitigations for those risks. I think that going through risk assessments as an exercise helps you actually much better understand what you're building, because in my own experience, oftentimes you don't know that the risks are there until you go through a process of trying to identify them. And even then, you can't fully identify all of them other than running into edge cases when the system is being used and then applying mitigation. So risk and impact assessment, key part of the governance process. Monitoring and response, I think it ties into that, right? Understanding and keeping an eye on where your system or your applications may be going wrong. Having playbooks for how to respond to incidents, how to address and deal with things like model drift or bias that may emerge in a model. And then lastly, and I think this is very important, particularly now as users are starting to get a better understanding of AI, is having plain English explanations and disclosures to your users, making sure that users know and understand what you're doing. So what does success look like? Really quickly on this, because obviously the less problems you have, generally the better, but making sure that your decisions are repeatable. You want to create routines, not multiple opportunities for heroics, not a good strategy. Making sure that the evidence that you have is auditable, and that comes into play in a number of ways. We'll touch on that more when we get into the ISO standard. Making sure that your teams are properly trained, not only from an AI literacy perspective, which is very critical, but also what to do when things happen. Making sure that you are continuing to improve because AI is doing that. So having processes in place to not only deploy the AI and have a governance system in place as of, for example, today, but also on an ongoing basis, and understanding that the cadence for that. And then lastly, that AI governance really should be a system and a process that becomes part of your everyday operations. It's not just a one-off. It's not a single instance, set it and forget it. So keep that in mind as well. All right, so that's the introduction, but why do we care about AI governance? So I'm going to just touch on and give you a few numbers around why AI is something that we're here talking about, why it is important. And I think that I did a bunch of research to try to make this timely, and I think that this really, I think, encapsulates the importance of AI from a business perspective, that the generative AI market is projected to hit $109 billion by 2030. That's 37% compound annual growth rate. And to give you some reference points for that, that's nearly 3 times more than cybersecurity, almost twice as high as cloud computing. And that means that generative AI is on average adding about $40 million in new market value every day between now and 2030. Smartphones during their hyper growth rate, for those of you who can remember that, which hopefully is most people here, 25%. So the numbers are significant. These are not surprising numbers, and you'll see this reported in other ways. In addition, AI regulations are coming into force. The EU AI Act, which actually went into effect August 1, 2024, has recently entered its second enforcement phase over a multi-year phased implementation. And so providers of general purpose AI models now have rules that apply to them before they can put the model onto the market. And so, for example, here, that the providers have to baseline by publishing technical documentation, which is what they're describing as a generally comprehensive summary of all training data to satisfy the copyright holders. I think that's an interesting requirement and could be the subject of another talk about just some of the risks involved or that are involved with training a model. But that's a significant, potentially significant obligation if you are developing AI. And non-compliance can result in fairly significant penalties, up to 35 million euros or 7% of worldwide annual turnover, in addition to product withdrawal. So fairly significant consequences. And this is something that is not just unique to the EU, but you are seeing state laws coming into play. I'll touch on the Colorado law. There's also a law in Texas that came online in June. So you're starting to see law and regulation around the world that addresses AI and AI deployment. AI-related enforcement actions are also happening, and this is interesting. So I picked three here that I thought would be good kind of diverse examples. In the first one, this has to do with the FTC enforcement, which is something that as of fairly recently, the FTC has been continuing to expand its enforcement around false advertising claims in the AI space. It's a little different than AI washing, which I'll touch on in a second, but the idea that you're seeing a lot of companies, tend to be startups or newer companies, who are making claims around their AI that are just false. Obviously, that false advertising is not a new concept, but I think that there's this, at least what you're seeing is that with AI, people are making claims and maybe hoping that their AI can back up those claims. Slightly differently is AI washing, where it's just entirely misleading statements around AI. I have a couple of examples that you can look up that come up in the SEC and investment context, but you're actually seeing or hearing that a lot. I mean, I've read numerous instances of companies saying they're using AI when actually they're using people, low-cost labor to do certain things. So it all falls under the category of AI washing, something to be very careful about, not only for your own marketing, but also the vendors that you're engaging with and whether or not what they're telling you is accurate. And then lastly, I want to touch on just real quickly deep fakes, because that's something that I think is a topic that we've been hearing about for a while now, but it's continuing to evolve. And the FCC has declared AI-generated voices to be illegal under the TCPA. There are some exceptions out there for the use of AI-generated voices, but generally speaking, you want to be very careful in that space if that is a space that you're in. And certainly if you are getting robocalls, I question how accurate this is considering the number of robocalls I seem to get, but it is something that we're starting to see enforcement on. And so this is, much of of what you see in laws where the law is trying to catch up with the technology. The challenge here is that the technology is moving so fast that we haven't seen that happen yet. The law has not caught up yet. All right, so I touched on this, I referenced this just a few minutes ago, the Colorado Act, and I wanted to point out here that one, of course, there are AI-related state-specific obligations that are coming into force, the Colorado Act being the first significant one, although there have been other AI-type laws both at a state and a local level prior to this. But the law came into effect last year. It's fully effective as of February 1, 2026. And I just want to point out here that one of the things that makes this maybe a little bit unusual or unexpected is that it requires both developers and deployers of AI to use reasonable care to prevent algorithmic discrimination. So Colorado is really the first U.S. jurisdiction to impose a statutory negligence style standard on AI providers. And I think we're going to see more of that. And there are rebuttable safe harbor via governance, which is my tie to governance and why governance is important, that if an organization can show that it followed the Colorado Act's checklist, which aligns a lot with what I'm going to talk about in the context of the ISO standard, it will earn a presumption that it has met its duty to use reasonable care. So I think this is a one to keep an eye on. Like I said, I think you'll see more. I think you'll see other states copy the Colorado Act. And so something to be prepared for, and we're going to see this proliferate. Okay, so here's the first of our poll questions. I think this should be a pretty easy one for all of you out there. Please go ahead and press the answer. I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. Is the market for AI stagnant, true or false? Again, this is not intended to be tricky questions or particularly difficult, but really for CLE purposes to show your engagement. And this is a live poll, actually, so you'll see the numbers. Okay, I'll say that we've got 100% engagement among the people who have answered, maybe not 100% accuracy, but pretty close. All right, I'm going to keep moving here. So I don't know what happened there. Getting into some AI risks. So I've talked a little bit now, giving you a little bit of an idea of where we're going with AI governance, but why are we doing this? What are some of the risks? So I've tried to take a lot of the research I've been doing and put it into a way that is maybe easier for at least me to wrap my mind around and to present to all of you. So I've got 4 categories here, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. But these are the types of risks that governance can help you manage. So if you're working with a client as an attorney, or if you're in-house trying to convince your business leaders of why they need to keep an eye on AI governance, these are some of the things that you're going to want to be talking about. Technical risks, which can include model drift, model hallucination, data errors, security risks. We've got legal and compliance risk, violations and fines, which I just touched on, potential for lawsuits, audits. Those are some legal and compliance issues that could come up for you. Ethical and reputational, I think, is really important, because oftentimes when you see public reporting about where AI is going wrong, you'll see them not only just talk about where it is wrong or why it is wrong, but it's a real black eye in the public space and from a PR perspective. So things like unfairness or loss of trust, lack of opacity, all potential issues. And then lastly, just business and operational issues, right? If you're using an AI tool, which is mission critical, and that tool goes down, and the biggest of tools, as you've probably seen, have gone down, right? Copilot has gone down, OpenAI's ChatGPT has gone down, then you run some risk. And whether you can deploy those models internally would then be maybe a next question to ask, but those are all issues. So just getting into this in a little more detail, because I thought this would be interesting, and I wanted to maybe give you some real world examples, and you could certainly look these up. Here are some actual examples of what I'm talking about, right? So I'm going to just maybe pick 1 or 2 from each of these, because again, I think they're interesting to talk about. You can read this, but to me, the Air Canada one was particularly interesting, because it was a situation where a passenger, a prospective passenger, bought a ticket, and then it was in a bereavement context. So he wanted to get a refund on his ticket. And so he asked the AI chatbot about how to get a refund. And the chatbot told him very convincingly and very confidently that here's the process. If you have, buy a ticket and you're a bereavement situation, here's how you can get a refund. All fictional, right? It made it all up. And in fact, the policy was the other way. This particular individual decided to go after Air Canada in a small claims court, well, all power to him, and he prevailed. And so it wasn't about the dollars. It was really to show that here was a company that was going to stand by its policy, notwithstanding that it had what looked like an agent, and that's how the court viewed it, presenting its policy. You don't want to be in that situation. And I wanted to highlight this one, particularly because chatbots tend to be, in most cases, developed and deployed by a third party. And so you as an organization may not have control over the training of that chatbot, the deployment of the chatbot, or any guardrails that surround that deployment. And that, I think, is a lesson more generally, more broadly, that you have to really be careful, not only for your own AI and what you develop, but what you are buying and what you're using. And that is actually, that concept carries over to the to AI bias in hiring, for instance, right? That if you look at the Workday case, for instance, in California, that a court will not allow you to stand by to stand on an argument that, oh, that was a tool that we deployed. We didn't develop it. We didn't train it. We didn't even know how it worked. No, that won't work, right? And so you have to be really careful and vigilant about the types of tools or integrations that you're using in your own systems. So again, interesting, and one that I've got a particularly interesting perspective on is the training of AI and getting into content. And so here's some more examples in the third and fourth categories. And you can see that, and the image generators there is what I was really just referencing. You probably heard about the numerous lawsuits out there around the use of copyrighted subject matter, but it's really a larger issue around data provenance and the question of whether or not you have the right to use the data that your model is trained on, or your vendor has that right. We'll touch on that in a minute around the types of diligence that you need to do when onboarding vendors. I think that at some point in the near future, getting into a conversation around AI in a vendor context will be almost unavoidable, because the truth is, much like many of you and your organizations and your clients are getting the AI, a lot of vendors and vendor tools are using AI to make things maybe better or faster or cheaper, or however you want to define that improvement. And so asking questions around AI, I don't think will be optional. There are still some open questions around what happens to those vendor tools if they trained on content that they shouldn't have been using, and then pass the trained model on to you, or whether directly or as part of a product or service. Still a lot of unanswered questions from a legal perspective, but it's something to drill down into and ask about. One other actually that I wanted to point out here is the CNET example, because to me, like, that should have been easily avoidable, right? And that, I think, speaks to, and this isn't going to be a topic or a presentation on the topic of legal diligence, but I think we as lawyers have an understanding, which is, I think, expressed in the ABA model rules, as well as many state rules and opinions, that we are responsible for ensuring that whatever we put out is accurate. So, legal citations, for example, legal information. And I think that there's a broader understanding of that now, because, when an organization like CNET pushes out AI-generated content that is filled with errors, that should have been easily avoidable. And for whatever reason, it wasn't. So that's a concept that I think you're going to continue to see emerge more and more as organizations start to really get on top of governance and the processes that fall under governance. Okay, so just really classifying the risk, and I did this in part to maybe help you if you're starting your journey in the AI governance space, to try to figure out where to prioritize your efforts, right? So this is just simple matrix: high impact, low impact, high likelihood, low likelihood. And I tried to classify the types of risks that I was just talking about into these impact categories. Again, just to hopefully give at least some way of looking at it that makes sense and allows you to, for example, say, okay, we're going to tackle the high impact, high likelihood first. I think those are fairly obvious ones to address. But these are all real risks. I don't want to send the message that you shouldn't deal with one of these categories. I think they're all important. But from a prioritization perspective, I think this is a good way to look at it. And then they're not mutually exclusive too. So I wanted to give this example, again, building on chatbot of the chatbot presenting hallucinated information to your customers. All of these risks actually exist in that single example. So there's technical risk with the LLM clearly hallucinating information. There's legal risk around deceptive claims. And in the Air Canada example, there actually was a judgment. So there was legal risk there. Ethical or reputational harm and loss of trust. I think Air Canada quickly pulled that chatbot. And I'm for anyone here from Air Canada, I don't mean to pick on them. It was a well-publicized incident. I don't think that chatbot has come back, right? So you want to make sure that you do things that foster trust, and that was not one of them. And then lastly, from an operational perspective, these are the types of issues that can cause support tickets to proliferate, create refund claim opportunities, just to create a lot of operational headache for you as an organization. So these risks, again, I want to underscore, they're not mutually exclusive. They are risks that you should look at for any of these deployments and make sure that you have an understanding. And that's why risk assessment is so important. Okay, so and for those of you who are entering questions in the chatbot, thank you for doing that. They're kind of going by. Like I said, I don't think not chatbot, sorry, the Q&A pod. I don't think I'm going to have time to go through all of them now, but I will follow up with them. So appreciate you doing that. Please continue to ask questions. Let's go into the next section, which I mentioned earlier, which is really the frameworks and standards. So ISO 42001. And this is not actually going to be a presentation on that standard because there's a lot to talk about there. But I want to first make the point that these frameworks and standards that are emerging there, you can look at them as being complementary, right? It's not just a single document or process, like I mentioned earlier. Think of it as an ecosystem. So you want to think about concepts of managing AI, using management standards, how you think about risk, using a risk framework, what you have to do, what you're required to do from a legal perspective, and then how do you prove that you are doing what it says it is doing, right? Merely saying, I think my AI is doing this, not going to be enough from an audit or insurance perspective. And there's a lot of trust that you have to build in your clients for them to believe that, particularly if they are able to see or prove otherwise. And that's, again, another interesting conversation we can have around using and deploying these products. And if that's something you're interested in, please let us know your feedback. Like I said, we're trying to develop these presentations on topics that people are interested in. So the AI governance stack, really quickly, I'm going to get into each of these a little more, but I look at ISO 42001 as your management standard. So you want to anchor your governance stack with that standard, or at least the concepts in this standard. Again, we'll get to that, more of that in a second. The NIST AI RMF is a great place to start for impact assessments. And as I'll touch on, it is an evolving risk management framework. So it is a good one to use, and it is a standard that many organizations are using. Understanding and aligning your governance with your legal obligations, particularly based on your industry, your jurisdiction, very important. So if you're in the EU, obviously we have the AI Act, but here in the US, state laws, sector-specific rules, all very important to make sure that you have an eye on. And then assurance and proof, right? So SOC 2 as a standard with AI and enhancements, and that is a way that things are going, right? So auditing under SOC 2 and then adding AI assurances or requirements, that's important to do, and that is becoming accepted in the industry. So that's what a lot of people are doing from an audit perspective, and then being able to prove that out through documentation. I'll get into a little more of that we go on. So just really quickly, taking a step back, let me define what ISO 42001 is. I'm not going to read all the rules on this, or all the words on this page. You can certainly read this if you download the PDF, but it has been in effect since December 2023, and it is the first international management standard for AI. So the way that I'm going to use it today is as a guideline, because it is a known standard. You can reference it to help everybody kind of understand, help me talk about AI governance with you, and help you understand what are some of the things that you can and should be doing. So I think that all of these things that you can do, these processes in building AI governance are really helpful, but none of them is absolutely required, right? And so it's going to depend on what you're doing, what industry you're in, the size of your organization. Those are some of the factors in deciding what you think you should be doing. I think I've got a slide on that in a little bit. So why seek ISO certification? Well, if you've done ISO 27001 for security, it's basically like that, but for AI. I was involved in that when I was at Adobe. If any of you were, sorry, I know it's a long road to travel. ISO 42001 is in the same way, right? It's not an overnight process for you. So it focuses on AI and really helps you, or is maybe a forcing function for you to create the policies and the roles that I referenced earlier to help you keep AI safe and useful. And it helps you prove out to your customers, to your board and directors, to the regulators that may be looking at what you're doing, that you manage AI purposefully. This is not an ad hoc process. You're not making it up as you go along. You've got a system, you've got a process. I think that's very important. And while a lot of it looks like it reads to or speaks to builders of AI, it really is for both builders and buyers or deployers and users of AI. It's really for organizations that are in any of those categories, because it creates the clear expectations for how AI designed, approved, monitored, and retired, which is an important thing to keep in mind. There's an optional certificate at the end, and I just want to point out in that last bullet there that if you are selling AI, then you actually may have to certify to your use and your deployment or development of AI, for example, in the context of an RFP, or if you operate in a high-risk domain or want any sort of external assurance. So it helps you in that regard as well. And I'm just being mindful of time. We're about halfway through. I'm close to halfway through my slides, so I think I'm going to be in good shape. If I run out of time, like I said, feel free to download the slides and feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions. I may run out of time, we'll see, but I'll try to talk a little bit faster. So what does ISO 42001 cover? Okay, so now we're getting into the meat of it. And really, I think layering on ISO 42001 to some of the things that I was touching on earlier in terms of responsible deployment of AI and responsible governance of AI. So more specifically, defining the clear responsibilities around who approves AI, who's supposed to fix the problems as they arise, which is not a trivial task in my experience, or may not be. And if you're a deployer, you know that some of these problems have the potential to grind your release to a halt. And then who's supposed to speak to regulators? The lifecycle checkpoints, again, this is more for deployers or developers of AI. When you're designing, testing, launching, monitoring, and retiring the AI, who's responsible for those things? What do you have to do? What are the gates that you have to go through? What are your rules around that? Data discipline is important, not just for where the data came from, what you're allowed to do with the data, who's allowed to access the data, how long should you be keeping the data, and then the things that relate to that, which I know our next webinar next month is going to talk about and focus on privacy. But when you talk about data that includes private information around individuals, biometrics, for example, there are other obligations that will apply, including data, from a data deletion perspective. So data discipline, very important. Data governance, very important. Fairness and safety, I think, depending on the nature of your system or the AI type of AI that you're using, can be very, very critical, because lacking a risk or impact review or a bias test could result in you pushing out AI that goes horribly wrong. It's easy to search for the headlines around that, but it happens a lot. So something to be very careful about. Transparency, having model cards, having your own usage notes, keeping track of the models and the data sets you're using when you're developing, so that you know what the AI can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. Very important. For your vendors, I touched on earlier, a lot of these governance issues come into play, but in a vendor context, right? So a third-party context where you don't just trust what they're saying to you, but you either verify the accuracy of what they're telling you, or you force them to do it. Well, the latter is probably typically easier and better to do, but getting the right types of evidence, having contractual protections, indemnities, for example, and then getting the right support from that vendor, all very critical elements of the vendor relationship. And all of this does map to ISO 42001's NXA reference controls. I'll touch on that as I get more into some of those controls. Think of that as a checklist, right? Even if you say we're not ready to or can't yet align to every obligation under the ISO standard, use it as a checklist. I think that's a really good use case for that. So this is what I'm going to talk about, some of the NX and reference controls here. I'll just do this at a high level just to save a bit of time. But as I just said, ISO 42001 doesn't just apply when you're building AI, but also when you're buying AI, right? It's a way to certify that you and your governance of AI is done in a responsible way, whichever role you're in. And so making sure that you define your policy and scope. And for many organizations, that starts with something like an AI acceptable use policy for your employees. It may start with or involve vendor playbooks or vendor policies. It could get into maybe deployment rules and policies. Whatever is appropriate for your organization, that's something to focus on. Again, I don't mean to continue to beat this drum, but procurement and vendors, very important. These are some of the things you can do in that context. Doing risk and impact reviews. And the importance here, or one of the useful pieces here, is not just that I'm saying these things to you, but also the NX references. You can look these up. Much better information there than this high level overview. Having the lifecycle controls in place, having the data governance, transparency, and incident response. So how do you get started? This is very simple. So I want to make it clear this is a simplified view, but writing a short AI policy, great place to start, right? What's allowed in using your AI? Who approves the AI? When do you escalate issues with the AI? Because I can tell you, you're probably going to have issues. And when you have them, you want to identify them, right? It's critical as a deployer or developer of AI, because that's how you improve your AI, but also you want your users to have a mechanism to report those issues to you. Not just, oh, I ran into an issue, I'm gonna find a workaround, right? That image I generated or that person I generated has 6 fingers, I'm just gonna generate another one. No, you also wanna flag that for your team. That's how they make improvements. Doing an inventory of your AI, actually fairly important, particularly if you're a developer. Knowing where the AI is being deployed, or the particular model or models that are being deployed, where are those models, what versions of those models you're using, which data sets specifically were used to train those models. I can tell you from my own experience, it sounds simple, it gets very complex very quickly. And when you can't figure out which version of a particular model or data set was used, you then won't be able to remediate the issues that you flag. So really important, particularly important for higher risk use cases. If you have a situation where you are identifying algorithmic discrimination in a model, you need to know how to remediate that, and therefore you need to know the model and the data that was used to train the model. Obviously relevant for developers, but as a user, you also want to flag that, because from a contractual perspective, a rep and warranty perspective, for example, you want to be able to flag that for the vendor and say, this is not operating the way that you described it, or that the way that you designed it. You need to fix this, right? important in general, particularly important for mission critical applications. The next one about gates, I touched on that earlier. This is really, I think, mostly relevant for deployers or developers of AI, making sure that you have your go, no go pre-launch, but also have your post-launch monitoring gate. So that you can ensure as much as possible that you're delivering an application that does what you want it to do. Updating your vendor due diligence with AI evidence requirements. So this builds on what I was saying earlier in terms of your vendor process, making sure that you're focusing on the requirements that you put in front of your vendor to say, you've got to do these things now for me, or I'm not going to consider your application. Collecting the evidence, making sure that you have record keeping around all the things you're doing to make sure that your AI systems are being properly developed, properly deployed. They, again, do what you say they're going to do. This is important not only from a legal and regulatory perspective, but in general from a development and deployment perspective to make sure that everything's working the way it should. And then lastly, have a regular cadence. I touched on this earlier, just to make sure that this is not a one-off, hey, we're done with it, we can go and be good for a few years. No, I would recommend reviewing things quarterly, make sure you understand what failed, what has improved, good to know not only what you're not doing well, but what you are doing well, and then what to fix, having a priority for it. I think in the software world, you always have a list of bugs, you always have prioritizations. This is much in the same way, and making sure that you're getting to the most critical ones first, right? You don't want those issues to keep happening. Okay, so if you're not going to certify, that's okay too. I said that earlier, right? This is not, I'm not here advocating that all of you immediately start working on your ISO certification today. You may not necessarily need it. If you're using AI in either a low risk or purely internal use scenario, there's no customer impact. Okay, that might be one reason to argue against immediately going down the certification path. If you're early in the AI lifecycle, again, maybe you want to first get alignment across your organization around your use of AI before you start thinking about certification. That makes practical sense. Maybe a different assurance is a better fit, SOC 2, for example, in a security context, and your customers are okay with it, right? They don't need you to certify to everything that the ISO standard provides. That's okay. And then lastly, if the immediate cost and complexity of the ISO certification outweighs the near-term benefit, you might want to create your roadmap for AI deployment and say, okay, from a governance perspective, here are things that we're going to work on first. For instance, if you're saying, if you're in the category, and there are many out there where you're saying, we haven't started going down this path, we haven't assessed the vendors or the tools, we're not sure what we need to be doing, then a lot of what I'm talking about is good for you to know and to plan for in the future, but you've got more immediate needs, right? You're working on some more practical near-term solutions for yourself. That's okay as well. So from a practical perspective, I think the path forward is really to understand and start adopting the core concepts. And I look at that in many ways as some of the other areas of law that we get into, privacy, for example, right? And understanding concepts of privacy by design. And so even if you say we're not building out the system, but we know when we're making decisions, we want to keep these concepts in mind, I think that a lot of that is relevant here as well. Understanding some of the core concepts around AI so that when you encounter an AI tool, and if you're like me, you're getting vendor outreach on a near daily basis of here's the next great tool you should be considering, you're starting to look at that through the lens of governance, right? And can you certify, or can the vendor certify to what they're telling you? Mapping to NXA, and I think that is a great, I guess, kind of a backbone or yardstick for measuring where you are and what you should be doing. A lot of great information there. Again, I would encourage you, at least as a reference, to get your hands on the ISO standard, to look at NXA, to map to those controls where appropriate, or at least start thinking about them, and to address some of the then obvious gaps that you see based on what you're seeing in the ISO standard. I think that those will be really useful. Many of the things I've touched on today. And then, you can even start running your internal audits or doing your own management reviews. They don't, you've got to start somewhere, right? So perfection probably isn't where you are on day one, but start doing it. That's what I would encourage you to do. Don't worry about your blind spots. You'll fill them in as you go along and as the needs arise. But I think the important thing is just start down this path. And these are some of the conversations that we have with our clients in terms of, how do you get started, right? You've got to start somewhere. Let's talk about where your more immediate needs are. Okay, we're at our next poll question. Again, this is not supposed to be a trick question. Please just press the answer that you think is right, and hopefully the answer will be obvious based on what I told you or I've been telling you in this last section. As a reminder, this is for CLE, so for those of you who want CLE credit, we'd encourage you to please do this. I'll give a few more seconds. We can take a look at the results and then move on. And I see quite a few of you are responding, so that's great. Okay. All right, this is good. I think most people are aligned that ISO 42001 is an international management standard for AI, and it is. But again, this is more about participation than necessarily being right. Hopefully we all understand that the answer is true. Okay, so operationalizing AI governance, the next section here. I'm going to touch on these really quickly because I think there's some overlap in what I've been talking about, and this really is just intended to go a little bit deeper into these topics. So I'm going to touch on this one actually fairly quickly because, as you can see from my label here, this is primarily focused on developers, and I've talked about this a bit in some ways. But understanding your models and data sets, making sure that you have traceability, ensuring that you can tier by criticality, and knowing what is high risk and low risk, and that gets to your risk assessment. Making sure you have a model registry and a data repository, which ideally has both model cards for the models as well as data lineage and data retention policies for your data. And then ensuring that your inventories are properly secured, right? So that where your models are resident and where your data is resident, it will not change on you without you or your control mechanisms understanding and knowing that is going to happen. The second one is also focused on developers, and I'm going relatively quickly because I think in my experience, most of our audience is not going to be in the role of developers. I didn't want to ignore it. I'm happy to follow up on these if any of you want to discuss. This is a lot of the work that I used to do in the product space, but ensuring that you have the appropriate checkpoints so that you can monitor for the types of issues that you care about, including model drift, including bias, including security issues, and then installing the gates that I touched on earlier, so that you can make sure that you have ways to understand and flag if and when these issues arise. And by gates, I truly mean go, no-go type gates. These are the types of issues that, for example, if bias exists, whether or not the engineers say that the product's ready to go out the door, it cannot or will not. So this is one that I think is a little more relevant to everybody here, because understanding how the algorithms or understanding from a data protection where there may be impact is important. So there are laws already that mandate a documented impact review, and I think that AI follows that. So having a paper trail that both auditors and regulators may expect, very important. And from just kind of an overview, I have a process here that I would encourage you to take a look at and consider. I'm not going to read every word here as well, but making sure that you know who the stakeholders are, making sure that you have the appropriate review or reviewers in place, having and keeping your evidence. Not as easy as it sounds, because you want to make sure you're documenting every step, and when there are a lot of people involved, that can get tricky. Tracking your completion status so you know and can prove out when you said something was done or when or what version you are shipping, and then rerunning this when you need to. And this is not something that I think would be news to anybody in the software space, but having proper version controls, knowing if something is updated, when you need to do code audits, when you need to do impact assessments, that should be part of your process so that there's no guesswork there. Everybody understands, okay, if we do this, then we have to do that, right? If we have this type of update, then we need to run a review. Bias and robustness, I apologize for the somewhat small text here, but there's a process here as well I've given you. You can take a look at. This comes into play, I think, really in almost every use case, but is particularly relevant if you are in a high-risk space, right? If you are using products in a way where there could be significant negative impact, for example, lending or hiring. Those are situations where you really want to make sure that you understand whether or not, or have assessed whether or not there is bias in the data set, which then gets expressed in the model or the system. So just at high level, again, checking for fairness, doing your own testing, deciding what is pass-fail to you, and having that standard and being able to prove that with, for example, a number. That's important. Making sure that the process, it becomes automatic. You do it all for every release from a testing perspective, and that you log the outcomes. And then making sure you fix those issues before you ship them. That goes to the gating issue. Making sure that if you have a log which shows a problem, that you're not just letting it out the door, right? Then I think you are, for the lawyers in the room, you're probably creating some pretty bad evidence for yourself, but you want to be careful there. So if you identify an issue and under your policy, you're requiring your organization to fix or remediate that issue, then you do it. Having incident response, I think it's important from a number of perspectives, including from a security perspective, but I think engaging in tabletop exercises, doing red teaming, making sure that your system is as hardened and as durable as it can be, I think is really critical. I know that's not relevant necessarily to everybody, but here's a process or at least an overview that you can, I think, dive into more if it's relevant to you. I think security and cybersecurity is probably relevant to almost every organization, but focusing on AI security in particular, I think is and can be very important. A lot of the principles that I've talked about apply here. I know I'm speeding it up because I've got 7 minutes here, but I want to get through to this point, which is our third question. It came pretty quickly after the last one, but please go ahead and answer this question. I want to point out, if anybody missed a prior question, that's okay. I think you just need to at least answer one of these to show participation. So particularly for those that might have missed an earlier question, please go ahead and answer this. And I don't know why I put a question mark at the end of that one. It really, I think, should be a period because it's a true false. But when deploying AI, it is important for you to detect bias before your users do. I think this should be hopefully a pretty obvious one to all of you. So I'm going to continue and move on. And yes, almost all of you answered the way I was hoping you would. For the one or few who didn't, you're still here. So that's good. Okay, so just a few best practices. I may not have time for the AI action plan section, but you can certainly take a look at it when we get to it, or when you get the slides. That might be a topic that we're going to have another webinar on in the near future. So stay tuned for that. So what applies to you? Well, I think clearly if you're in the EU, the AI Act applies to you. But I think even if the model sits outside of the EU, particularly if you're a developer, you still want to comply or at least do your risk assessment. And there's a couple reasons for that. Again, your model could make it to the EU, in which case you may have an issue, a compliance issue. But also, I think and we're already seeing this, that other countries and jurisdictions are mirroring the AI Act. I don't even think it's likely. I think they are doing it. I think you're going to see it. U.S. negligence standards are likely coming. The Colorado Act that I touched on earlier is a good example of that. Other states are likely going to be learning from AI, from Colorado's efforts around AI, and are going to echo that. And then you're going to see sector-specific enforcement or regulation. The FTC is just one example of that. as AI and the applications of AI continue to proliferate, continue to become better understood, I think you're going to see regulators start to catch up, start to create regulation. You're going to see law on these issues. So I think that's just a matter of time. The AI Action Plan, in many ways, pushed that out a bit for the US, but you're going to see it, and I think you're going to likely see it more at a state level than a federal level. Here's some practical guidance or suggestions from a contract drafting and vendor negotiation perspective. I think there are at least 4, but I flagged 4 AI clauses that you should pay particular attention to. And I guess AI clauses maybe not be the best way to characterize them. I think there are clauses that impact AI. That might be a better way to look at them. But your rights, or the vendor's rights to use inputs and outputs, so data flows, very important. The bias and robustness and IP warranties that exist, also important. Audit rights for model artifacts. So what types of rights do you have to take a look at how the vendor developed their AI? And then the indemnities, right? And I know that indemnities is a pretty tricky issue, but you are seeing companies starting to indemnify for the use of their systems. That's obviously a common negotiation point, but it's something that you should take into account in this space as well. Data transfer and zero data retention. I touched on the rights to use inputs and outputs. Those are related, right? Making sure that you, if your data is flowing to a vendor system, particularly if it's going to be resident in that vendor system, to speak to cross-border data transfers, to maybe try to require zero data retention to ensure that they not only don't use your data to train and improve their model, but don't even keep your data. Very important, because sad to say it, but I think the default that you can generally assume is that if there's silence on these issues, that the vendor is retaining your data and is training on that data. And the recent issues around OpenAI, and they pulled this within a day, but being able to see what people were asking ChatGPT and the response that it was giving, it's obvious that they have all that data and they're retaining it. There's no better proof than that. So be very careful about that. And again, that's a very interesting conversation for another day, because it's also very clear that as much as you hope your employees are not using their own pocket AI to do your work, they are. A lot of confidential and private information is being provided to products like ChatGPT. So be very careful there. And then making sure that you ask for the vendors to prove their information if they can. Okay, I'm going to go really quickly through some of these practical guidance. I think you'll be able to see it in my slides. I talked a little bit about these triggers and the types of notice that is required. This obviously GDPR is from a privacy perspective, but making sure that you understand the obligations that you have to your users and put those in your playbook. Colorado also has an obligation for deployers to notify the Attorney General if algorithmic discrimination is discovered. Make sure that you put that into your response matrix. And then documenting AI-specific harm. I've already touched on the documentation issues, but making sure that you do that because, for example, some of your insurers may require it to continue cyber liability coverage. So understand where these issues have other impacts. Very important. Privacy. Again, really quickly, making sure that you are doing what you need to do from a privacy perspective when you're handling data, doing what you can to encrypt, tokenize, or differentially privatize that data, making sure that you're choosing the lawful route based on your jurisdiction, and then retraining when you need to, right? If a data subject requests deletion, you need to have not only a process for deleting that data, but then retraining your model that was trained on that data. So understanding and building in those types of protections to your process. And then I think this may be my last slide in this section, but employment and civil rights exposure, I think is really important. There's a lot of risk here. There has been already litigation here, making sure that you know where your risk is, that the employers are still liable, even if a third-party algorithm screens, and the amount of AI tools in the hiring space is only proliferating rapidly as each day goes by. So this is something that you as a first party are likely to deal with, that your clients are likely to also have to deal with when they're hiring. Oh, and this is the last section. So IP and trade secrets, I'm not going to go through this word for word, but making sure that you understand where there are IP concerns, because there can be many. So I'm gonna stop here and just give you a few reminders in closing. I really appreciate you joining me. I was worried that I was going to have a lot of material, and I did, but maybe that'll tee this up for a continued webinar in the future. We're going to have more webinars, so thank you for being here. Keep an eye out for more of our communications. I want to remind everybody that the program has been approved for legal education hours, so you can, again, report your hours. Click on the continuing education sign-in link at the top of your screen. Certificate of attendance will be emailed to you tomorrow along with the recording. And I would ask if you could please complete our short survey. We use your feedback. We really value that feedback. We read it all. We use it to plan our future programs that are relevant and applicable to your needs. So the next presentation will be September 23rd on AI and data privacy. I invite all of you to attend that. It's going to be a great presentation. Again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I will sign off. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.